Hashtag the last Tidemark. The air in Port Blossom always tasted of salt and anxiety. Alara felt it on her tongue as she calibrated the sensors on her research drone. The metallic tang, a constant reminder of the ocean that was both her city's lifeblood and its greatest threat. Below the gleaming, sterile balcony of her laboratory, the morning sun glinted off the formidable sea wall, a monument to humanity's stubborn refusal to retreat. Beyond it, the Pacific Ocean stretched, vast and deceptively calm. Alara was a marine biologist, a profession that in Port Blossom felt more like being a historian of a dying world. She chronicled the slow, painful degradation of the coral reefs that had once made this coastline a wonder. Her days were a meticulous routine of data collection, analysis, and writing reports that were read by committees and then, it seemed, promptly ignored. The official consensus was that the city's technological defenses were sufficient. Alara's data screamed otherwise. This morning, her focus was on a new set of underwater images showing further bleaching in the North Reef. The vibrant colors she remembered from her childhood dives with her grandmother were now just ghostly whites and murky browns. It was a silent, creeping catastrophe. She sighed, pulling her dark hair into a practical ponytail. Frustration was an unaffordable luxury. Later that day, seeking a break from the sterile confines of the lab, she took the public transport ferry towards the city's older, lower-lying districts to visit her grandmother, Mara. The ferry route was a study in contrasts. It passed the new arcology, a self-contained, vertical city for the ultra-wealthy, its glittering towers piercing the sky, completely immune to the rising waters. Then, it chugged past the sprawling districts where most people lived, a chaotic maze of reinforced apartment blocks and elevated walkways. Here, the seawall was a patchwork of old concrete and new, hastily applied sealant. It was a visual representation of the city's deep social and economic disparity. As the ferry docked, Alara's attention was caught by a commotion in the main plaza. A crowd had gathered, their angry shouts echoing off the damp buildings. At the center, a young man with a megaphone stood on a makeshift stage. He had a fierce, passionate energy that drew people in. This was Keel, a name she knew from news feeds and community alerts. He was a prominent activist, a constant thorn in the side of the city's administration. They build towers for the rich while our foundations crumble. Keel's voice boomed, raw with emotion. They sell our coastline to corporations while our homes are designated as acceptable losses. This isn't a future, it's a managed surrender. We need real adaptation, not just high walls for the wealthy. Alara paused, watching. She understood his anger, she felt it too. But his methods felt chaotic, disruptive. Science, data, rational arguments. Those were the tools for convincing people, for enacting real change. Shouting in a plaza felt like screaming into the wind. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the crowd. She saw a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps dismissal, before he turned back to his audience. To him, she was likely just another face from the heights. The privileged sector where the main labs were located, the gulf between the worlds felt as wide as the ocean itself. She continued on to her grandmother's apartment, the activist's fiery words still ringing in her ears. Mara lived on the third floor of a weathered building, the lower levels of which have been surrendered to the sea long ago. Her small home was a sanctuary of old-world comfort, filled with books, preserved marine specimens in glass jars, and the smell of dried herbs. The ocean is angry today, Mara said by way of greeting, her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, looking past Alara and out the window. She had a way of speaking about the ocean as if it were a living, breathing entity with moods and intentions. It's a low-pressure system moving in, Nana, Alara corrected gently, kissing her grandmother's wrinkled cheek. The barometric pressure is dropping. Mara smiled, a knowing, patient smile. You and your numbers. I have the tide marks on the old pier and the ache in my bones. It's a language your senses will never learn. She poured them both a cup of herbal tea. I heard that boy, Keel, on the public address system again. He has a lot of fire. He's reckless, Alara cattered, settling into a worn armchair. He encourages civil disobedience. It's counterproductive. It makes the administration less likely to listen to reasoned arguments. And have they been listening to your reasoned arguments, my dear? Mara asked softly. The question hung in the air, unanswered because it needed no answer. Alara looked down at her hands. The fight for Port Blossom's future was a battle being fought on two different fronts, and she feared both were losing. one waged with data and quiet desperation, the other with megaphones and public fury, and between them, the relentless tide continued its patient, inevitable rise. The news came 3 days later, delivered by the city's emergency broadcast system with a chilling, artificial calmness. A meteorological event, designated Superstorm Corvus, had formed in the mid-Pacific and was tracking directly towards Port Blossom. Its projected intensity was unprecedented. The city's formidable sea wall, the pride of its engineers, had never been tested by a storm of this magnitude. An immediate and urgent state of emergency was declared. For Alara, the news was a sickening confirmation of her worst fears. Her climate models had predicted an increasing probability of such an event for years. The administration, however, had focused its resources on mitigation strategies that favored corporate interests, like the new ecology, rather than on city-wide resilience. Now, the consequences of that short-sightedness were bearing down on them. Panic, however, gave way to a surge of scientific purpose. Amid her preparations for the storm, she was running a deep-sea scan when she found it tucked away in a treacherous underwater canyon, a place of powerful, unpredictable currents just beyond the main sea wall, was something impossible, a small, thriving colony of coral. The images from her drone were unmistakable. While the rest of the region's reefs were ghostly white, this patch glowed with vibrant, healthy color. It was a species she had never documented before, one that was somehow resisting the warming, acidifying waters. It was a biological miracle. The potential was immense. If she could secure a sample, it could be the key to cultivating a new, resilient generation of reefs, a natural barrier that could protect the coastline for the future. It was a long-term solution, a genuine flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But the canyon was dangerous on a calm day. In a superstorm, it would be a death trap. Meanwhile, Keel was mobilizing his own response. He saw the storm not just as a natural disaster, but as a political one. The government's evacuation plans were a disgrace, prioritizing the commercial districts and the heights while offering little more than vague instructions for the vulnerable populations in the low-lying areas to shelter in place. To him, it was a death sentence. "They're abandoning us," he roared at a packed, frantic meeting in a community hall. "We have to force their hand." His plan was audacious and dangerous. They would occupy the construction site of the new luxury coastal high-rise. The site had a fleet of heavy transport vehicles and building materials that could be used to create emergency barriers and evacuate people from the most at-risk zones. By halting the corporate project, they would not only disrupt the powers that be but also commandeer the resources needed to save their own lives. It was an act of mass defiance. Alara heard about Keel's plan and was horrified. It was madness. He would be putting hundreds of people in the direct path of the storm. She had to talk to him. Finding him was difficult, but she eventually tracked him down to a makeshift command center near the docks, where volunteers were frantically filling sandbags. "You can't go through with this," she said, confronting him directly. The air was thick with the smell of rain and fear. "You'll be leading people to their deaths. It's better than leaving them to die in their homes," he shot back, his face grim and streaked with dirt. "While your people in the labs write reports, we are taking action. What's your solution?" "Another graph?" "My solution," Alara said, her voice tight with passion, "is a species of coral that has survived everything we've thrown at it. It could rebuild our entire coastal ecosystem. I have to retrieve a sample. That's a real, sustainable future. Your protest is a suicide mission. A future is a luxury we don't have if we don't survive next week," Keel retorted. "Your coral can't stop a 10-meter storm surge. We need immediate protection. We need an equitable evacuation, not just one for those who can afford it." Their argument was a clash of two desperate logics, the immediate versus the long-term, direct action versus scientific process. They were both fighting for the same thing, survival, but their paths were irreconcilably different. They parted in anger, each convinced of the other's folly. That evening, a profound sense of despair washed over Alara. She went to see Mara, seeking some of her grandmother's quiet strength. She explained her discovery, her plan, and her conflict with Keel. Mara listened patiently, her gaze fixed on the churning, grey sea outside. When Alara had finished, Mara rose and walked to an old wooden chest. She pulled out a collection of hand-drawn charts and worn leather-bound books. They were old nautical maps, passed down through generations of their family, who had been sailors and fishers. "Your sciences are wonderful," Powerful thing. Alara, she said, her finger tracing a faint line on one of the charts. But it only sees what is there now. It does not remember what was. The chart showed the coastline as it was over a century ago, before the major sea walls, before the mass displacement of coastal communities. Mara pointed to a spot. Here, she said. The old maps call it the Whispering Passage, a series of submerged lava tubes. The fishermen knew it as a shortcut. Dangerous but reliable if you respected the currents. It leads directly into the base of the canyon you spoke of. She looked at Alara, her eyes clear and steady. The storm will make the main canyon impossible to enter from above, but perhaps, from below. A spark ignited in Elara's mind. It was a crazy, high-risk idea, but it was a path, a way to bypass the worst of the surface turmoil. Her grandmother's ancestral knowledge was providing a solution that her modern technology had missed. As she looked at the old chart, Mara shared a story about Elara's great-grandfather, who was caught in a terrible squall, and only survived by letting his small boat drift with the currents instead of fighting them. He understood that some things cannot be defeated. Mara finished. They must be navigated. Remember that, child. Your mission is important, but so are the people that boy is trying to save. A reef with no one left to see it is just a pretty garden at the bottom of the sea. Mara's words settled deep in Elara's heart, a heavy and profound truth. She now knew what she had to do, but the choice of how to do it had become terrifyingly complex. The storm was coming, and with it, a test that would define not only her own future, but the very soul of Port Blossom. The sky turned a bruised, unnatural purple as the first bands of Superstorm Corvus lashed the city. The wind shrieked like a predator, and rain fell in horizontal sheets that stung the skin. From her lab's reinforced windows, Alara watched the sea swell into a monstrous, churning beast, slamming against the sea wall with a force that made the building tremble. The time for deliberation was over. Her small, agile submersible, the Stetho, named after the medical instrument for listening to a heartbeat, was ready. She was going for the coral. Simultaneously, across the city, Keel and his followers put their desperate plan into action. Under the cover of the screaming wind, they cut through the fences of the high-rise construction site. They were met with little resistance. The corporate security forces had already retreated to safer ground. The site was an eerie ghost town of half-finished structures and giant machinery. It felt like a small victory, but the real battle was against the approaching ocean. Keel directed his teams with frantic energy, shouting instructions to hotwire the heavy trucks and start moving concrete barriers towards the most vulnerable residential areas. It was a race against the clock and the tide. Underwater, Elara's world was a maelstrom of sound and pressure. The Stetho was tossed about violently as she navigated towards the coordinates Mara had shown her. The entrance to the Whispering Passage was terrifyingly small, a dark moor in the seafloor. Debris, torn loose by the storm, shot past her viewport like missiles. Taking a deep breath, she guided the sub into the lava tube. The violent chaos of the open sea instantly subsided, replaced by an unnerving, claustrophobic calm. Here, the storm's rage was a distant, muffled roar. The passage was a tight, winding tunnel, and she relied entirely on her sonar and the old chart, now digitized and overlaid on her navigation screen. It was a journey into the planet's memory, guided by ancestral wisdom. Above, the storm hit with its full, catastrophic fury, and a splitting groan echoed across the lower districts as a section of the main sea wall, the one patched with sealant and prayers, finally gave way. The ocean poured in, a destructive, unstoppable torrent. Keel watched in horror as the water surged through the streets he had been trying to protect. His protest had become a life-or-death rescue mission. The construction site was now an island in a raging, newly formed sea. To the rooftops, he yelled, his voice nearly lost in the gale. Help people up. Use the trucks to reach the higher windows. The small act of defiance had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. Deep beneath the waves, Alara emerged from the passage into the relative quiet of the canyon, and there it was, a breathtaking spectacle of life. The coral glowed with an internal, otherworldly light, deep blues, vibrant pinks, and phosphorescent greens. It was thriving, an impossible garden in a world of decay, working with practiced precision. Her submersible's robotic arms carefully snipped several small, healthy samples, placing them into a secure, pressurized container. She had it. She had the future. As she began her ascent, her communications system, which had been offline in the passage, crackled back to life. It was flooded with the city's emergency channels, a chaotic chorus of panic and distress calls. And then she heard a voice she recognized, strained and desperate. It was Keel. "Dart, we're cut off, on the Miller building, taking on water fast, several injured. I don't know how long we can." The transmission cut out. A cold dread washed over Alara. She checked his location. He was in the heart of the flooded zone, miles from her position. The logical, scientific part of her brain screamed that her mission was complete. She had the priceless apples. Her duty was to protect them, to get them back to the lab. To risk the Stepho now, to venture into the storm-ravaged, debris-filled floodwaters, was to risk everything on a reckless rescue. But Mara's words echoed in her mind. A reef with no one left to see it is just a pretty garden at the bottom of the sea. In that moment, the division between her world and Keel's vanished. The long-term and the immediate had crashed together with the force of the storm. She looked at the glowing container holding the coral samples, then at the navigation screen showing Keel's last known position. She turned the submersible eastward, directly into the heart of the city's wounds. The journey through the flooded streets was a nightmare. Submerged cars, floating shipping containers, and fragments of buildings created a deadly obstacle course. Alara pushed the Stepho to its limits, its powerful floodlights cutting through the murky water, revealing submerged street signs and the ghostly outlines of drowned homes. The sense of displacement was profound. This was her city, twisted into a terrifying, underwater landscape. She finally located the Miller building, its lower floors completely submerged in the waves crashing against the third story. A group of people were huddled on the roof, Keel among them, trying to hold a makeshift shelter against the wind. He was clearly injured, a bloody rag tied around his arm. Alara surfaced the submersible nearby, its sudden appearance like a vision from another world. Relief, stark and absolute, washed over the faces of the stranded survivors. Using the sub's external speakers, she coordinated with Keel. "I can't take you all at once," she yelled over the storm, "but I can act as a guide and a shield." For the next hour, that is what she did. The Stepho became a beacon of light and a protective barrier. She used its powerful sonar to identify safe paths through the treacherous waters and its hull to deflect larger pieces of debris, allowing Keel and the others to fashion a crude raft, and move a few people at a time towards a more stable, taller structure nearby. During a final, perilous trip to retrieve Keel and two others, a nearby apartment block gave a final, shuddering groan and collapsed, sending a massive wave towards them. Alara expertly maneuvered the sub to take the brunt of the impact. Alarms blared inside the cockpit as the Stepho was thrown sideways, but the small vessel held. She had saved them. In the grey, weeping dawn after the storm, the true scale of the devastation was revealed. The lower districts of Port Blossom were a ruin. The gleaming, new high-rise on the coast was a shattered wreck, its foundations scoured out by the sea. The government's failure was absolute, its promises washed away with the tide. The city was broken, but it was not silent. A new spirit, born of shared trauma and survival, began to stir. In the makeshift relief center, Keel, his arm properly bandaged, found Alara beside her damaged but intact submersible. The precious coral samples were safe. "You came back," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier fire and filled with a weary respect. "You had the prize, the future, and you risked it." "You were part of that future," Alara replied, looking at the exhausted faces of the people around them. "I realized they aren't separate things. In the shared ordeal, their two worlds had merged." His passionate fight for the present, and her meticulous hope for the future were two sides of the same coin. They were both essential for survival. Months later, Port Blossom was a city being reborn from its own wreckage. The catastrophe had acted as a powerful catalyst for political and social change. The old administration was gone, replaced by a new council of community leaders, engineers, and scientists, including Keel and Alara. The reconstruction was guided by a new set of principles: sustainability, resilience, and social justice for all. The focus shifted from fighting the ocean to learning to live with it. Alara's lab became the heart of this new vision. The resilient coral, cultivated from the samples she had risked everything to retrieve, was thriving. The first nurseries were being prepared for transplantation, the beginning of a great, living barrier that would be grown, not built. The project had become a symbol of the city's new resilience, a testament to hope and innovation. Keel, now a respected leader in the Reconstruction Authority, worked tirelessly to ensure the new infrastructure was equitable, protecting the entire community, not just the privileged few. The ghost of the old seawall was a permanent reminder of the follies of the past. On a calm, sunny afternoon, Alara, Keel, and Mara stood on the deck of a research vessel, looking down at the first of the new coral nurseries shimmering in the clear water. Mara looked at the new, higher tide mark stained against the city's remaining structures. "Every ending is also a beginning," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wisdom. "The ocean gave us a harsh lesson, but it also gave us a chance to listen." Alara and Keel looked at each other. They had both been right, and they had both been wrong. It wasn't science or activism alone that would save them, but the fusion of the two, tempered with empathy and a deep respect for the world they were trying to protect. The water before them was calm, and for the first time in a long time, the salt in the air tasted not of anxiety, but of a hard-won, cautious hope. This new tide mark was not an end point, it was the starting line.